we will continue in this discussion because we are in the second part of this interesting issue about religious authority in secular societies. And just a few simple considerations. Historically speaking, the figure of Imam dates back to the first period of Islam. Specifically, Imam is in this context considered the guide of a community prayer, not only like now the Friday prayer, but also other prayers made by a group of Muslims. To use a Latin word, he is an antistes, a person who, standing in front of other believers, recites some religious formulas and performs typical religious gestures, bows, prostration. However, as Professor Audad and as Mohammed Assas reminded us, Imam is neither a priest nor a clergyman who in the Christian context are purposely consecrated to the role of religious ministers. On the contrary, imams are selected at local level. Generally, members of an Islamic community choose someone who is considered knowledgeable and wise, who understands the Noble Quran and is able to recite it correctly and nicely. From this point of view, we can therefore argue that an imam is a respected member of a Muslim community. As to their nomination, in some communities, a Muslim may be recruited and hired to be an imam after undergoing special trainings. In others, imams are chosen from among the existing members of an Islamic denomination without any specific training program. Besides, there is no universal governing body to supervise imams. This is done at the community level as well. This may explain why, as religious ministers in Europe, imams are almost all self-taught people. As citizens, though, most of the times they have a precarious job. During the week, they normally take care of things other than religion. They perform religious functions in their spare time. We may say that at the end of the day, we know little or almost nothing about imams in Europe, which is also due to the fact that the state's law or European law, as Professor Aula said before, do not recognize them neither as religious ministers nor as religious authorities. In any case, as imams, they play a crucial role in Muslim communities, which altogether hold more than 50 million believers, many of whom are immigrant. To this respect, we must also remember that many imams provide a range of welfare services that strongly affect the integration process of Muslim communities. This means that imams play a crucial social role too. All things considered, there is no doubt on the fact that the imam's most important function is based on religion. which proves that all other functions, including the social and political ones, come from and are based on its religious authority, even if not recognized and affirmed by the sacrament. An imam is in fact recognized and affirmed through everyday leadership, whose legitimation derives directly from his religious role. So far as Islamic organizations are concerned, the theological absence of any sacred ordination does not necessarily imply the absence of people capable of managing the sacred rules of Islam. From here stems some reasons that, in the last years, have increased the debate of the necessity to ground European Islam on European soil, so the dream on the large perspective, as before was underlined, which may be perceived through the state institutions, university, with the collaboration of imams as religious authorities. The example is given by the fact that the Islamic representatives are now building partnership with universities in the UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, for co-designated religious curricula. In this context, it seems that imams have become the stewards of both their communities and the everyday life of millions of Muslim people who, as such, hold fundamental rights, including the rights to be different and to exercise their own religious freedom. So I have the pleasure to give the floor to eminent scholars like Professor Nielsen and Professor Scharburg, and their competence and their curricula are so interesting that I give immediately the floor to them. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'll start with an apology. This was thrown at me 2 weeks ago. I have forgiven you, Mohammed, thank you. But that means that you will not get a deep scholarly research paper. I've thought instead that a conference like this gathers together people from a variety of disciplines, not just from people who are familiar with Islamic history, Islamic theology, Islamic institutions, but also social scientists, anthropologists who work with Islam in Europe, Muslims in Europe, but don't necessarily have the other, just as the other doesn't necessarily have this. I suspect a number of you have probably experienced, as I have, going into conferences with serious scholars and being told about all these imams who are leading the European community, the European Muslim community. And then you have to tell them, look, sorry, you may think you know what you're talking about here, but the word is wrong. So what I'm going to try and do is to lay a general basis so that at some point through my short presentation, there's going to be some of you who will think, come on, this is so basic, I know all that, but you may find other people among the participants who don't, for whom this is not basic. Then there'll be other things that for them is basic, but not for the first lot. I'm going to divide my talk into two parts. I want to look first of all at the DNA of the concept of Imam, the way we use it today, what lies behind it, what are the historical antecedents, and then secondly, go on to looking at the concept of Imam as it's used today. Now, obviously, well, perhaps not so obviously, but in this case, certainly, the word has its origins in the Quran. But like many of these Islamic terms, in the Quranic usage, it doesn't have the technical sense that we have filled into it later. It means, in the Quranic sense, it appears about 10 times, in Quran in singular and plural. It means someone or something which is the model for a community, a moral model, a moral guide for a community which is held together by this shared ideal, morality, and so on. So you'll find that Pharaoh leading his people into hellfire is described as an Imam. The book of Moses and the record of your personal deeds are also described as Imams. It's only subsequently that the word Imam begins to be filled with actually a variety of meanings. Let's start with the one that is usually referred to immediately when you throw the word on the table, namely the one who leads the prayer. Strictly speaking, that person is only Imam while the prayer is being led. So really anybody who has the competence to lead the prayer and know enough Quranic passages to be able to do that is an Imam. So this idea that the Imam has to be highly qualified doesn't necessarily follow. Then, of course, it gets applied as an honorific to someone who regularly leads the prayer in a community. Then more formally, and this goes with the passage of time and the growing institutionalization of the Islamic world in the early century, someone can be appointed officially to the post of Imam in a larger mosque with an income attached. And in the seriously large mosques in the big cities, that person will be one of several official posts attached to a mosque. I remember a story told me by a journalist, Syrian origin, on one of the international Arabic papers published in London, told about how when he was a student in Aleppo, he was the first young man from his village in the countryside over towards Idlib who went to university, and because he was a scholar, he was highly regarded in his village, and they asked him to act as Imam at the weekends when he was home from university. Unfortunately, one day one of his villagers turned up in Aleppo during the week and caught him having a drink with his student friends in the local bar. That was the end of his function, not appointment, but the end of his function as Imam in that village. Then the term Imam, also from a very early stage, comes to be applied to the leader of the community. Now, initially, this is most common among the Shia, applied to Ali and his descendants, whether we're talking about the Ismailis or the Ithnashidis, where you have, in that context, a religious authority in the absence of a political authority, although under the Fatimids, the two aspects become united in the Imam Caliph of the Fatimid dynasty. And when you come up to the modern period, Khomeini was very often called Imam, although he himself refused to lay, although he was being encouraged very strongly by some faction, he refused to lay claim to be the returning 12th Imam. Among the majority Sunnis, the term was very early on applied to the Khalifa Amir al-Mu'minin, especially in medieval political theory. In the work of al-Mawardi, the word that al-Mawardi uses is Imam rather than Khalifa. But it's also, as we know, applied to the great religious scholars of the formative period. So you have the Imams of the various madhahib, both Sunni and Shia, Thirdly, with the passage of time, the role of the Imam as a leader of prayer is impacted by official appointment, which links the Imam to the political authority. So from an early stage, it becomes common for the first sign of dissent against the political authority in the community being the refusal of the community to pray behind the officially appointed Imam. And that actually still applies today. Some of you will know about the internal conflict within the Muslim community of Bulgaria within the last 5 years or so. And there was a point when the old mufti from the communist period, through a conspiracy between him and his faction, the government, and the law courts, found himself reappointed as head of the Muslim community in Bulgaria against the wish of the majority of the community. I happened to be in Plovdiv on a Friday during that period, and there was the Imam appointed by this, as they saw, usurper, leading the Friday prayer. There were only 2 people in the mosque that day for Jummah, because the rest of the community had simply decided they don't accept the authority of this mufti, so they showed their dissent by refusing to pray behind that Imam. They went somewhere else for their Jummah. So there's a certain type of Imam, prayer leader certainly, who frequently acquires a status beyond simply leading the prayer. And in those situations, that is where you begin to get the expectation of a minimum of education. However, you still have generally, in the past, you still have, well, to a certain extent still today, you still have generally illiterate communities in villages in the countryside where the Imam can acquire some local authority of learning. In the cities and towns, however, the Imam, certainly one officially appointed, very often becomes increasingly a part of a government-sponsored bureaucracy, whether we're talking about the Imams appointed by the Wizard al-Awqaf in Egypt or by the Sheikh al-Islam in the Ottoman Empire and so on. That doesn't mean that all Imams are of that position. There are still privately owned mosques which are put together by the community or sponsored by individual wealthy individuals in the community who will appoint their own Imams. And the government authority that wants to put a stop to that, to get control, will always has found itself in trouble. Let me come up to the Western European situation. Here the Imam, we've heard variety of takes on the Imam already, and to a certain extent here, Carli has already given half of my lecture. Thank you. The position of the Imam increasingly commonly, including in popular usage, is a confluence of 3 different perspectives. It is the prayer leader, but it is also very often a religious authority. But thirdly, and here's the new perspective that comes in the Western environment, it's also a kind of priest, which leads to some of the complications and confusions that we are dealing with. Now, the Imam as prayer leader, as we've already heard hinted at, local worshipping communities, with or without a fixed mosque or prayer room, will very often make informal arrangements for someone to lead the prayer. Now, it may be the same someone on subsequent Fridays, on a chain of Fridays, especially Friday Jummah, but it may be different ones. It is still, if you like, the very basic, informal leader of the prayer. Now, it's no good to say the European countries don't recognize this. They do, because most European countries in their immigration law have a special status within immigration law for religious leaders. In the first phase, back in the 70s, 60s, and into the 80s, in fact, it was really up to the community itself to define what it meant by a religious leader. The immigration authorities would accept the community's definition of the religious leader. But as we begin to find, first of all, tightening immigration rules in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, increasing paranoia relating especially to Islam, the governments begin to impose criteria for what constitutes a religious leader. In Britain now, for example, to be accepted as a religious leader for the purpose, an Islamic religious leader for the purpose of UK immigration law, the person, among other things, has to have at least the equivalent of 2 years of higher theological education. This was not the case in the 70s. But this meant that in the early phase, the communities could make their own choice as to what the function of an imam was. Secondly, imam as a religious authority. The organized networks within the Islamic world and within the Islamic migration have tended to see the imam post as the location of the most effective access point to influence and organize the emigre communities. So the networks of the Diyanet especially, but also the Jamaat-e-Islami and others, have organized their activities around trying to put their people in place in mosque communities as imams. The local mosque communities often welcomed this because mostly they did not, in that first generation, mostly they did not have the resources to give the person an income and to give the person a place to live. We saw instances, certainly in Britain, I suspect elsewhere in Europe, we saw instances where a small local community coming from a village in Kashmir, say, would get hold of a property, set it up as a mosque, bring in someone from their village who traditionally would have functioned as imam there, to come and function as an imam. They would be given a room in the same apartment that was also functioning as a mosque. The person would often have no English, would not be able to play any kind of role in the leadership of the community other than leading the prayer and teaching basic prayer ritual and some Quranic text to the kids in the mosque school. Representing the mosque community in those situations towards the outside world, which would normally mean the local authority, would be taken care of by the members of the community who are sponsoring the mosque, very often small-scale businessmen, occasionally an academic or a professionally trained lawyer or doctor. The exception, of course, is the Diyanet, with its very often treaty-based dispatch of community leaders, imams, to Turkish emigre communities in countries like the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and the Netherlands. It's just a footnote here. It's worth noting that in the European environment, the Western environment generally, there's this whole new institution which has no precedent in the historical Muslim world, namely the Islamic Cultural Center, with a director, at least, often with more than one full-time person. Now here, the director also becomes known as an imam, and suddenly you have imams at opposite ends of a spectrum. You have a village imam functioning in a small converted apartment somewhere in a provincial city, locked away, isolated from the broader environment, who simply leads prayer and runs a little school for kids. And at the other end, people with serious financial and political sponsorship from sometimes from the countries of origin, just as often from Muslim countries with the financial resources, whom likely are not the countries of origin. You can put your own names on those countries. And then thirdly, the interesting one here, the Imam as priest. It's a confluence of the Imam as religious authority tradition and the European concepts of priesthood, Catholic or Protestant. In the early phases, Muslim communities locally were often put on the spot of embarrassment when local government or church want to enter into some form of dialogue with the local community. In the case of the churches, it might be pink cloud visions of interreligious dialogue. Let's get together and compare talk about our ideas about prophecy or revelation or scripture and so on. And of course, the local church, through its priest, would contact the equivalent person in the Muslim community who would be this uneducated imam who couldn't speak the local language. More precarious was when the local government wanted to engage with the Muslim community for reasons of social welfare, education, or whatever, for reasons of integration policy, and found that the person they thought they were going to be talking to was, to put it frankly, absolutely useless. They were uneducated, they were unprepared for this new role. It was not a role that they had expected, and nobody had expected. Even when there was an imam with some learning, one of the big problems in Germany in the 1980s was all these imams that the Diyanet were sending over were educated. They had theology degrees from the Lahiyat faculties, but they didn't speak German. This actually produced a period of what? Discuss 20, 25 years, when the German converts to Islam played a key role of communicating here. In Britain, they never played that role because they were always among the South Asian immigrants, Muslim immigrant communities. There was always someone who could speak English and could therefore act on behalf of the community. So in Britain, the converts were for a very long time seriously marginalized. With the passage of time and all the various processes that we all know about, there's a growing necessity for communication with the administrative and social environment. This drives the development of Muslim organizations in all kinds of ways. I'm not going to go into detail. You can all read Joel Fetzer and Christopher Soper's book, or more recently, Jonathan Lawrence's. You have examples all over Europe. We have the almost absurd situation in Belgium in 1974, when the government decides to add Islam to the list of recognized religions, I think basic to avoid the Arab oil boycott. And the way the Belgian recognized religion structure works means that the way it was set up in 74, and failed very quickly, was that the director of the Islamic Cultural Center in Brussels, just around the corner from the European Commission, was to be the Belgian Muslim archbishop, effectively. Didn't work. And you have various ways in which the various countries' institutional tradition of relating Islam and state, Islam and the public sector, some involving public financial support, mostly not. The Muslim communities find themselves that if they want to link into those public resources, whether they be symbolic or material, they have to change their expectations of religious authority, develop their expectations of religious authority. By this time, the term imam has come to be accepted, both on the European side and on the Muslim side. Not khatib, not any of the other terms that traditionally applied. The term imam becomes the one that everybody begins to use without really thinking through how that relates to the DNA, the historical antecedents. In fact, there is a precedent for this. It's a precedent that many Muslims, for political reasons, don't particularly like to face. But the precedent is the rabbi. The rabbi, traditionally in Judaism, is a learned individual. He's a scholar. Much more like, much closer akin to a mufti, certainly than a prayer leader. But over the passage of time, the rabbi comes to be treated, related to, as the Catholic priest or the Protestant minister. So you've got a process of, it's an ugly word, you've got a process of ecclesiastification. Put that one in the dictionary. If we use it if we use it often enough, it will go in the dictionary. But this process also requires competent personnel. But that begs the question, competence in what? Theological competence? Possibly. Probably. Legal competence, but legal competence in Sharia or legal competence in European law? Competence in relating to European political and social and educational institutions, competence in being able to communicate with the wider society, the kind of competencies that are commonly shared nowadays by priests and pastors. So in fact, if you're talking about training with those competencies in mind, you might as well send your trainee imam to a Protestant or a Catholic theological faculty, leave out the theology bit, but keep all the other bits, law, pastoral theology, and so on, and then replace the Catholic or the Protestant theological bits with Islamic theology and religious teaching. So I say, let's bring on the papers of this conference. It's an occasion to investigate beneath the simplistic surface, to identify the variety of conceptions and their implications for authority and training and the possible developmental priorities. But don't be naive about it. European governments consistently refuse to engage with any kind of suggestion that they might like to sponsor homegrown imams until 9/11. After that, the tune changed. You cannot avoid, in the political maneuverings, you cannot avoid a security dimension. It's weaker now than it was, but at the same time, it's more broadly spread than it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nielsen, to underline the crucial point to set the agenda. So, Professor Charbot.
Thank you very much, Jorgen. I suppose, the respondent is always in a difficult position. Some responses just sort of summarize the keynote, where the people in the audience is wondering why we're actually sitting here, why is he telling us things that we've already heard. And then there are obviously those responses that try to sort of overdo the keynote, where actually the keynote speaker goes, well, I've actually been invited to give the keynote. So I will try to sort of strike the balance between the two, perhaps contextualizing a bit more the points Jorgen has made, and also going back to, I think, remade this intervention in the previous session, that perhaps, the issue about imam and training of imam is more about the dynamics of religious authority within modern contemporary Islam. And we learned a new word, ecclesialization.
Shall I say it again? Ecclesiastification.
Ecclesiastification. I was using the term Christianization, but I think that's probably a bit too short. It doesn't do justice to it. I think it poses there's a particular challenge that sort of traditional church-state relations in Europe create expectations that other religious communities, as Jorgen said, replicate existing structures with the rabbi or imam becoming a quasi-priest or quasi-pastor. This is obviously problematic as it imposes institutional settings specific to Christianity on other religions. It becomes more problematic when state authorities require mosque communities and organizations to become like churches and to form umbrella bodies. Very often these efforts do not do justice to the actual diverse and fragmented nature of Muslim communities, and the fact that many of these mosque communities are rather transnationally connected to the countries of origin or across similar networks across Europe than to other organization communities within their own country. I suppose perhaps one positive example where it might have worked, and I'm not going to venture to say the word again, in a European context is the history of Muslim chaplains in the UK, in universities, prisons, and hospitals, where there has been a kind of Christianization of Muslim authority structures, which, and again, there are people here in the audience who worked on that, which appear to have been quite successful. And perhaps it has been successful because it was very practical, very pragmatic. You didn't need, what we say in German, the kind of ideological Überbau. You don't need a great philosophy. It's really about solving the actual problems that Muslim inmates, people in hospitals face. So, maybe that's the example where it sort of worked. I think the issue of umbrella organizations and sort of governments, states sort of enforcing particular structures on Muslim communities that do not reflect the realities becomes relevant when it is about the training of imams. I mean, who's going to run it, who's going to supervise it, universities or the state authorities, with whom are they going to interact and so on. And I will come back to this later. While these are some of the sort of particular challenges imposed by the European environment, there are obviously important historical dynamics around the development of religious authority in Islam since the 19th century, which equally have an impact on the local level in Europe. And I mean, in the previous session, I'm not quite comfortable with the kind of dichotomy created between Muslims in Europe, Muslims in the Muslim world. Muslims in Europe should do their own thing because they're Muslims in Europe, and Muslims in the Muslim world, they live in a different context, they should do their own thing. I think the situation is much messier. I mean, one of the things, the organization networks to which mosque communities are connected are not traditional institutions, but there are modern constructs. I mean, Darul Uloom, it might have a traditional curriculum in Islamic jurisprudence, but it's a modern organized institution. It was created in the 19th century by Indian ulama in response to British colonialism. Al-Azhar, yes, an ancient institution, centuries old, but now, within the last 150 years, it has become a modern university. So it's not, the dichotomy, I think it doesn't quite work, and then obviously it overlooks the kind of transnational connection. And I think the problem is not necessarily that these institutions are too traditional or teach a traditional curriculum. I think the problem is that these institutions are obviously located in specific environments, and the people going to these institutions receive the training that they need in order to fulfill the roles assigned to them by the state or by the communities in these contexts in which they are. And obviously, very often, these institutions are based in political contexts that are autocratic. So they're not equipped to deal with the problems of Muslims living in the West and to represent Muslims in the West. Again, not so much because their education is traditional or it lacks intellectual depth. I think it just serves the needs of a different context. Many of the institutions were reformed or actually created in response to the rise of secular education institutions in the Muslim world, the rise of a secular professional and intellectual elite, secular here in the sense of studying at a secular institution, has challenged the educational monopoly of religious institutions of learning in Islam, but has also undermined the social position of ulama in the Muslim world. Secular professionals have become the new state employees and bureaucrats and not the ulama, and the brightest sons of the educated elite would not pursue the path of religious education, as maybe 200, 300 years ago, but would try to become lawyers, doctors, and engineers. And perhaps primarily for sons from underprivileged families, the kind of traditional role of religious education as an instrument of social mobility remains important. I mean, forgive me if my anecdotes and examples are from the Irish context. I mean, Ireland, if you don't know, is a small country located in the Western European periphery, because most of my fieldwork has been based there. The Imam of the Shia mosque, the major Shia mosque in Dublin, is sort of half Iraqi, half Saudi, comes from a very, very prominent clerical family. His father was the representative, the wakil of Ayatollah Sistani in Qatar. He grew up in a household where, Sistani, Hoi, all these big guys came in. And when he graduated from school, as one of the best in his class, naturally told his father, I want to become an alim. And his father, being a cleric, an alim, coming from a cleric family, said to him, you're too bright to become an alim. You must become a doctor. And obviously, he didn't have much of a choice. He became a doctor and he qualified in Ireland as a surgeon. And after he sort of fulfilled his education, he said to his father, well, I've done what you did. I'm now a surgeon. Now I'm going to become an alim. Then he went to Qom to study there. But I think it shows the dynamics that perhaps within the Muslim world, because of these transformations, the position of the alim as the kind of traditional intellectual elite, it has lost its prestige. And again, Jorgen mentioned that on the local level, the kind of dynamics where the imam is actually not the leader of a community, but is the employee of a mosque committee, which consists or is dominated by secular, educated professionals, businessmen, whose capital is based on their education and their wealth, and obviously do not necessarily see the imam as particularly qualified to be a leader in any sort of sense, because they might look down at the educational path he has pursued, and also, very often, as we've seen in European context, the imam might not have any formal religious education at all. It's just some sort of ad hoc appointee because, this person will seem to be particularly pious or, knows the Quran and so on. So again, in Ireland, there are around 30, 35 mosques with imams, with regular Friday midday prayers. Of these 30, 35 mosques, only 3 imams have a formal religious education. All of the other people being imams in these mosques, they have a secular, they're agriculturalists, engineers, and so on. And I think, there are probably similar situations in other parts of Europe. I just want to bring up one issue briefly. That's the issue of gender. I mean, I know there will be sort of presentations on that later on, but perhaps I thought it was worthwhile to bring it up in today as well. It's obviously not surprising that when we talk about institutional authority structures in Islam and compare them with institutionalized authority structures in Christianity, that there is a male focus. But I think there needs to be more research that looks at how female forms of authority evolve and develop in European context. And I think there will be papers on that as well later. Now, I haven't thought it quite through, but I just want to sort of share some of my ideas here. I mean, there's a lot of debate, and we'll have papers on that later on, of training imams in Europe, establishing sort of European universities, departments of Islamic theology, establishing Islamic colleges, and so on. There are obviously various political agendas very often behind it, and sometimes genuine concern to train sort of a new generation of imams. But I wonder, the graduates of these institutions, what career prospects do they actually have? What standing do they have in the community compared to somebody who graduated from Al-Azhar or Dar al-Ulum? I mean, again, I don't want to be sort of too critical here, but I think, it's just a question that, whatever it is, there are European Muslims, they live in Europe, and we need, European-trained imams, but the traditional institutions of authority in the Middle East, in South Asia, they are important to provide legitimacy to, figures of authority in Islam and Europe. And very often it is either implicitly or explicitly expected that the people who are imams here have had at least some training in these institutions, otherwise sort of seen as second-class leaders. So rather sort of problematizing that more, I wanted to sort of come up with a suggestion, and perhaps what we need, and this is just an idea that came up in the airplane this morning, is imams that have benefited from a kind of European university education. So they have the kind of intellectual skills, the cultural competency to engage in intellectual debates in a European context, but who also have a sufficient exposure, maybe not exposure is not enough, immersion in the traditional scholarship and spend time at traditional institutions of scholarship in Egypt. Again, not the kind of sheikh tourism where somebody just listens to the lecture for a couple of weeks, grows a beard and thinks he's a sheikh, but where there's a strong connection with these traditional institutions, which I think is important for these imams to gain the capital. And I've been thinking of the kind of the superstars of European Islam, those that are invited to speak at conferences, those that can actually connect to young Muslims. And most of them, yes, they've got PhDs from European universities, but at the same time, they've studied for a couple of years at Al-Azhar or other institutions. And so rather than trying to fuse these institutions, the kind of Aligar model where we try to combine Islamic education with modern scientific education, maybe we can keep them separate and allow these contradictions to exist, because again, these people need to navigate in these different contexts. Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, we are in a hurry for the coffee. Coffee is there, but I hope there is some questions. you. Il microphone, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorgen. Well, it's always, I mean, if you come up with this kind of clear, simple, simplistic, no, it's not simplistic,
No, not.
kind of sketching out imams, I think that's great. And especially this priesthood, the last point you mentioned, you referred to Diyanet. I spoke with the people of Diyanet 2 years ago, I think, and it was interesting that precisely on this point, is this idea of the priesthood. They said, of course, we are in charge of the theological, the knowledge part, but we should also be in charge of this priesthood part, because after all, and then they came up with a kind of a cultural argument. They said, well, you know, the Turkish origin of Muslims in Europe, etc., etc. So there was a very interesting way in which they tried to include and control the whole spectrum. In fact, of what you mentioned. But just to add to what you said, I think that's.
Any question? Oh.
Hello. Thank you very much for the interesting insights. Of course, we find ourselves in front of a question, and we have no theological answer. Some people from the Muslim world, they think that for every new question, there is ready-made or already existing theological answer. In this case, we find ourselves in the Muslim world, and as Muslims living in Europe, helpless. There is no answer. The answer should be elaborated in interaction with the Western context. This means that we have a challenge. This challenge does not, it is not a challenge to the Imams only, because the Imam, in 90%, the Imam is a reflection of reality. He does not create reality, because the Imam is the product of his community. The community shapes the Imam, and not the contrary. So I totally agree with Nielsen when he says that we have to raise the level of intellectuality, so to say, to ask the Muslims how they should interact with Western, with European reality, and understand the spirit of religion and the spirit of zeitgeist of the time. This is the challenge that we are facing as Muslims living in Europe. The Imam plays a tiny role, his reflection of a bigger reality. He does not shape this reality. And probably, most probably, we are expecting the Imam to play a role. He has neither got the means nor, the qualities to play this role. So it is a question. Curiously, Europe is outgrowing geography. We speak in terms of the end of geography. Europe hasn't got an identity which is clear-cut and finished and clear. It is a process. It is building itself up. So how can we separate Europe and as Muslims living in Europe, how can we or could we cut ourselves from Islam, which is faith, a religion? So the relationship between faith and geography should be given some interest. Thank you very much.
Please. The microphone. Here.
Thank you very much for your intervention. My question is just out of curiosity, just because you started this interest to Islam comparison with the ecclesiation. I will add it to my dictionary.
I shall offer a training course in the pronunciation of that word.
Okay. So for me, I was wondering if you made a comparison between a country, because we are now just speaking about the West, the European level, but we don't need to, we need to remind that dealing with Islam is a national issue before being a European issue. It depends on many questions. But I was wondering if there is a difference in dealing with Islam between a country which was already dealing in terms of colonial administration with Islam or not before dealing with Islam as an immigration issue. So if we take a country like France, for example, it's going to be different from a country like Finland dealing with Islam about before and after immigration started to come to the country. So I was wondering if in the case of Germany, Diyanat and Turkey is not the same relationship with France and the Maghreb, for example. So I was wondering if you have any clue or any answer for that. Thank you.
Professor,
Right.
please.
Thank you. A number of things came up here. I'm reminded from one of the things that Oliver said of the director of the Diyanet-related organization in Copenhagen, the religious culture, the religious attaché sent by Turkey, who was actually a PhD graduate from Leeds. I have had a fair amount to do with him in the years I was in Copenhagen, and he was very conscious of the long-term prospect that Turkey cannot carry on sending imams to Europe, Turkish imams to Europe, for short periods of 3 to 5 years, that Turkey has to sponsor the setting up of a permanent native cadre of imams. So he has managed to sponsor, I think it's by now 10 or 12 Danish-Turkish young men to go to study theology at some of the Turkish university, Ankara, Istanbul, and one or two others. They have a joint program of Islamic theology taught in English. And he sent students to this, so they come out of the English language Ilahiyat program, graduating on the same level as Turkish students trained in Turkish, come back to Denmark. In the interim period, they are salaried by the Diyanet, but in the long term, they have to find themselves some source of income independent of the community because the community hasn't got the resources. But in fact, he's not faced with that problem because with one exception, none of them have returned to Denmark. They found themselves with a good Turkish university degree, with Danish and English, and have found much better paid jobs going into the international export and similar departments of major Turkish companies. Intrigued by the question, this theological answer or absence of theological answers to a lot of these questions. I mean, some Muslims would argue whether theological is the right word here, but let's use it loosely. One of the unanswered questions is precisely the role of the Imam. But then, are you not in danger the moment you start theologizing the question of the role of the Imam? Are you not then in a situation where you are reinforcing the process of ecclesiastification? The more you fill the Imam with the theological content, the closer the Imam is becoming to the priesthood, which Muslims always deny that they have. You get caught in some internal paradoxes. I won't say contradictions, paradoxes here. The question of countries with or without a colonial history is a fascinating one. And I think there are a number of potential PhDs in it. Just comparing the colonial history of Britain with that of France, or for that matter, the Netherlands, you're talking about three very different animals. I would argue that the German relationship to Turkey is a pseudo-colonial one. Not colonial in the traditional sense, but certainly a pseudo-colonial one, given the relationship that was built up with the Ottoman Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm, especially after Bismarck left the sinking ship, and so on. And finally, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, one of the subtitle words here is authority. Among young Muslims, perhaps the biggest authority is none of these. It's Sheikh Google. Yeah, don't you think that's enough? I do.
Shocking. So, thanks a lot to our guest. And now, coffee break, but sorry, just for a quarter of hour.
You'll be lucky.
So we'll begin again.